Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the channel. I'm Angel. I'm very excited because after almost 2 months, I have finally finished reading this doctoral thesis, The Communities of Spain and Peru, by the Peruvian novelist and anthropologist José María Arguedas. The edition I have here was published in February this year by Paidós, belonging to editorial Planeta Peru. You know that Mr. Arguedas is better known for his novels like Jaguar Fiesta or Deep Rivers, but his academic production has been kind of overlooked. So this edition promotes the reading of his thesis. On page 33, he states that he intended to know better about the indigenous communities in Peru. He believed that in Castile and Extremadura, Spain, he would find ancient forms of communal organization still surviving, which would help understand the history and the current reality of how our communities function and are organized. Something similar is said as a conclusion on page 304. The purpose of this thesis, he says, was to conduct a comparative study of the three communities and use that study as a source of knowledge for the analysis of the historical process and the current study of communities in Peru and other Hispanic American countries in which, because a high ancient culture was developed, the native population survived and was exploited by the conquistadors. To achieve such exploitation, as we already know, the invaders organized and reduced the native population into communities whose norms were based on Spanish models in a much higher proportion than what until now had been proved or supposed, especially in what concerns to Peru. On page 493, he tells us the state of the art. There is a book by François Chevalier called The Formation of the Grand Dominions in Mexico. It dates from 1953, some years before he wrote his thesis. And that thesis by Mr. Chevalier was on the application of the Spanish institutions in the organization of Mexican communities. So Arguedas says something similar has not been attempted in Peru until his own thesis. The similarities of those communities in Zamora and León with the Peruvian ones is really striking. He said that on page 37. He opted for Zamora in the northwest of Spain because León was blocked due to ice, so that's a kind of coincidence. In that province, he spent some months as he got a scholarship by UNESCO, so he could prepare his thesis in the degree of ethnology at San Marcos University here in Lima. On page 49, he says that he intended to study the communities in Sayago, which is a county in Zamora, in a comparison with Peru, but he would focus on 4 communities in Lucanas, in the south of Ayacucho, here in Peru, given the vast diversity of communities in our country. Sayago, located in Zamora, also had a number of towns like La Muga or Fermoselle, and the capital was called Bermillo. He focuses his investigation in the latter and also in La Muga. I have to say that I was rather afraid of reading such a long academic text. The thesis itself has 395 pages, let alone the articles, appendices and photos, some of them never published before in this hardcover edition. However, it has been a real pleasure from beginning to end. His work as a novelist is evident here. He tries to establish some balance between a text showing art and beauty, but academic at the same time. Sometimes it feels like a narration with a beautiful Spanish language, not the cold or tedious text I would have imagined. The similarities between Peruvian communities and those in Sayago are striking. Page 156. Women in Sayago were the same as upper-class ladies in Andean towns. This is linked to page 157, a religious moral rule that forces women to respect their husbands in life and death, not marrying again and wearing black. This also happens in some isolated towns in Peru, he says. Page 165 on the social classes, both in Bermillo and in Puquio. There are comuneros or peasants much richer than hueracochas in Peru or señoritos in Spain, let's say the bureaucracy, but they are considered as low class. About this issue, page 257 tells us that there are vecinos or hueracochas, the upper class, and comuneros, the lower. The hypothesis is that the Spanish who were comuneros in Spain became vecinos in Peru, upper class. And the Indians became the new comuneros in a subordinate status indeed. Page 258 says both this word comunero and indio is pejorative. That discrimination and lack of justice was reinforced by the church. Page 330 states the Catholic Church was an instrument of coercion and power for the benefit of the landowner. In Abancay, southern Andes, Mr. Arguedas heard priests preaching that the landowner had to be obeyed as if he was God. The vecino in Peru imposed on the natives the status that he previously had in Spain. Page 316. It's certain that native councils were based on Spanish models, the Spanish ayuntamientos, or what is now municipalidades, but adapted to the ancient Ayu community from pre-Hispanic periods. On artistic traditions, page 245 tells us about the respigo, or dance in which the guests give presents to the just married, similar to the ones in Peru, in which the guests promise in documents to give them money or even land. On page 476 it says that in the near town of La Muga, there is still a musician or tamborilero who plays some instruments called gaita and tambor. And some of the many types of flutes in Peru might have had a Spanish origin rather than a pre-Hispanic one, as hypothesized on page 484. Page 313. The Cabildos Dominicales or Sunday councils occurred both in Sayago and in Puquio in southern Peru. However, there are some differences as well. Page 130. The effect of the Civil War. Who can sin after seeing that? One man was murdered by the Phalangists because he didn't make the salute with his right hand. Let's remember that this research was made during the military dictatorship of General Franco. So, just focusing on this almost absent artistic sense, page 220, girls' games are the only form surviving from all dance and singing. Fortunately, they still knew many songs, which Mr. Arguedas copied and shared in his thesis. Page 483 states again that, unfortunately, traditional music in La Muga and Bermillo has virtually disappeared, but in the Andes it has remained vital. On traditional costumes, page 155 says that they have disappeared in Bermillo and La Muga, although on page 128 it's mentioned that in La Muga some people still keep them at home. Page 138, in Sayago, nobody gets drunken. 159, there are no fights in Bermillo, different from the Andes where it occurs when the comuneros drink, as page 296 summarizes. On religion, there's no superstition, page 178. 251, and the people's reaction to death is that there are no beliefs on the soul coming back. Death is just God's will. About family, page 169 says that family is a solid nucleus of individuals connected by the need to work. Women work very hard, but their status is very high at home, contrary to what is popularly said. Page 177. There's no artificial kin. There are not even compadres or that religious link between the father and the godfather. Page 248. In Sayago, family is only children, parents, and grandparents. Collateral relatives are weak. 249. The elderly do not enjoy special consideration, unlike in Peru. 300. In Peru, a landowner can even hit comuneros publicly, imprison them, or even kill them. A señorito in Bermillo can't do so much. Aside from similarities and differences explicitly expressed, I have identified an amazing lots of characteristics of the communities in Sayago. On page 133, for example, Peasants love to accumulate money just for the pleasure of seeing it accumulated. This is linked to page 161, the power of the church. Being stingy does not mean not cooperating, and the church discourages that and treats it as a bad political jam. 151. An informer in Bermillo called C.A. who stated the division into social classes, señoritos or upper class and the labradores or peasants. If one labrador becomes a señorito, he even despises his parents. On page 259 it says that the four categories of señoritos or upper class, from intellectuals to any people who do not work on the farms. Page 163. A rich peasant is richer than 90% of the señoritos, but even he considers himself lower class. As 261 says, low class means every peasant, rich or poor. Page 164. Bermillo was not absorbed by landowners, especially because of its poor quality of land, the soil. However, because it is the capital of the comarca or county, some bureaucracy has appeared who don't work with their hands, and that has created a new class, the señoritos, creating friction between them and the people as well. Tension among the two castes. The señoritos consider the low class as dirty, brute, ignorant, hypocritical, and coward. In Peru, there was a similar discourse, but we cannot forget the racial or ethnical factor in our country so as to explain or justify those differences. Page 288. The señoritos are not aristocracy based on lineage. They only need a university degree and working in a public office. 383. Bermillo is not a very typical community because it's the only divided into castes. But because of this, its study can give an image very similar to the one in most of Spain and some communities in Peru at that time. However, in La Muga, they insist that there are rich and poor, but everybody's equal, as stated on page 451. The triumph of Franco was linked to the señoritos. Nobody has forgotten the execution in Bermillo during the Spanish Civil War. On page 232 it is expressed vividly. The civil guard creates fear and more fear. Other aspects I can see about marriage and relationships. On 173 it says that marriage faithfulness is solid, adultery and faithfulness is considered a monstrous act. 230. A married man can only dance with his wife. 181. 7-year-old boys and girls don't go together anymore. If not, there is physical punishment. 223. The Catholic fear of sex makes people isolate boys from girls. 226. A woman who has a child and no husband is stigmatized. 238. Women who have lost their virtue, or the deshonradas. 240. Only the woman is guilty, not the man. And 240 again. And fathers can deny it. So the man was kind of forgiven. Women was the only responsible. They could even deny their illegitimate children. Another aspect that caught my attention is how beautiful and precise the Spanish they speak is, according to Mr. Arguedas. It says that on page 286, for example. Despite their poor formal education, they are so eloquent. 369. Intellectual culture, not promoted by teachers who were too rigid in their syllabus and just provided them with some little knowledge. 371. Their writing is very low with many orthographic mistakes. Their knowledge of the Americas is reduced to what some immigrants coming back from Argentina or Cuba have told them. Even professionals on page 271 knew so little about Peru, they thought Peru was a little city near Buenos Aires. 379. Their many writing mistakes contrast with their oral eloquence. There are some characters who informed who gave Mr. Arguedas a lot of information. On page 475, both CA from Bermillo and AS from La Muga. The latter got angry only when criticizing the church and the selfishness of the upper class, of some rich in the community. Both were eloquent and wise. So was Doña Sabina, the lady who was the owner of an inn or posada in Bermillo. Mr. Arguedas got to know almost all of the peasants and was well regarded. I have read some articles that even nowadays he is remembered in Bermillo de Sayago. In this luxurious edition, so beautiful I haven't dared take any note with my pencil, there are 34 photos he published in the thesis and 28 that have shown here for the first time. There are also some documents from newspapers written either by him or about him. All of this makes this book, despite its high price, a must to understand one of the greatest writers of the 20th century in our country, a man so sensitive, so tender and knowledgeable, a man who was aware of his white self and his indigenous self, both sources emerging into a mestizo, racial and cultural, embodying our country this way. A man that gives us so many decades later his thesis in which it is not a foreigner studying us, as is usually the case, but a Peruvian, local and cosmopolitan, studying a country which has changed dramatically since then. So this document can help understand both Peru and Spain, and is a real bridge between the history and the societies of our two great nations. Highly recommendable indeed. Bye bye.